Have you ever met someone who thinks he has it all under control, making unreasonable rules, forcing others to obey as if they were the law? Have you ever felt injustice but didn't know what to do? This is the story of a Karen HOA who created her own fake police force, spread fear in her neighborhood, and thought she could control everything. But power doesn't belong to the one who screams the loudest. It belongs to those who dare to stand up and say, "Enough." What will you do when you are forced by unreasonable rules? Will you accept it or fight back? Join me to discover this story, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you like stories like this. I still remember the day I first realized something was wrong in the once peaceful Greenwood Oaks neighborhood, which had suddenly become so tense that it was hard to breathe. It all started when Linda Monroe, a member of the HOA in Austin, Texas, moved in. At first, I thought Linda was just a normal resident, but gradually her actions revealed her intention to control every corner of the neighborhood. Linda didn't stop at just following the HOA's rules. She created her own set of rules, extremely strict and unreasonable, with the aim of forcing everyone to live her way. Soon, a strange phenomenon appeared in Greenwood Oaks that I had never seen before. A neighborhood patrol with simple uniforms, walkie-talkies, and cheap flashlights. These people were not professional security forces or real police, but simply residents who Linda had recruited and trained in an extremely clumsy and unprofessional way. She seemed to have established herself as the ultimate authority in the neighborhood, and Linda's patrol was the tool to exercise that control. I often walk through the streets in the early morning, and the first thing I notice is the constant presence of people in neighborhood patrol uniforms. They travel in Linda's old golf cart, which is equipped with a flashing light bar to give it the appearance of a real patrol vehicle. Every time they appear, the atmosphere around the neighborhood becomes darker. I remember one time as I was walking out the door, I saw them patrolling carefully along the sidewalk, walkie-talkies and flashlights in hand, as if they were on an important mission to ensure the security of the whole neighborhood. Linda created the neighborhood patrol not to protect the community, but to enforce her own unreasonable rules. I quickly learned that the patrol's every move was to harass and control the residents. They showed up at random times, early in the morning and late at night, to check for seemingly minor violations. The orange tickets posted on every door became a symbol of this unnecessary interference, even though the reason for the fines had nothing to do with any reasonable HOA rules. The arrival of the neighborhood patrol changed the way people in the neighborhood felt about privacy and safety. Greenwood Oaks used to be a place where neighbors could talk, share, and resolve small issues amicably. But since Linda began implementing her security project, the atmosphere has become filled with fear and insecurity. People are constantly worried that even simple actions like hanging a wind chime or repairing an old item in the yard will cause the neighborhood patrol to come by and give them unreasonable punishments. I couldn't help but wonder about Linda's true motives. Perhaps she just wanted to create an image of herself as a guardian of order in the neighborhood, but in reality, her actions only made people feel oppressed and deprived of their freedom. I witnessed Linda and her teammates confidently going through each house, checking every little detail, as if they were conducting a serious investigation. Linda's intervention not only destroyed the sense of security, but also made the relationship between residents become distant, cautious, and no longer intimate as before. Looking back, I realized that Linda Monroe was more than just an ordinary HOA member. She had arbitrarily turned herself into an authoritarian leader, a self-proclaimed policeman of the neighborhood, and her means of enforcing her will was the neighborhood patrol that had absolutely no legal authority and only brought fear and instability to the entire community. From then on, Greenwood Oaks gradually became different, losing its inherent peace due to strict rules and brutal control of an individual, making each passing day a challenge to the personal freedom of each resident. I used to think Linda Monroe was just a power-hungry shill who wanted to turn Greenwood Oaks into her own personal kingdom. But then I realized she didn't just want control, she craved domination. And when Linda took action, she didn't just impose, she actually scared people. The tickets came in a deafening silence. At first, they were just orange pieces of paper taped to a few doors, but after a week they flooded the neighborhood like threatening letters from a powerful figure. Every time someone discovered a new ticket, the neighborhood shuddered. No one knew whose turn it was today. No one could guess what the reason was, only that Linda wouldn't stop. Mrs. Dell was one of the first victims. An elderly woman, she lived alone in a small house covered with trees at the end of the street. She had a small wind chime that sparkled in the sunlight and tinkled when the wind blew. It didn't bother anyone else. In fact, it made the neighborhood seem more picturesque and warm. But to Linda, it was a crime. One morning, Mrs. Dell found a notice taped to her door, the words glaring, "Noise pollution demands immediate removal." And with it to her door, the words glaring, "Noise pollution, immediate." It came with a $50 fine, an absurd amount for an even more absurd reason. Mrs. Dell quietly took down the wind chime, but she wasn't just taking away a decoration. She was taking away her own little joy, her former sense of peace. Linda continued. Mr. Evans, a retired car enthusiast, was on her list. He spent a few hours a day working on an old car in his yard, a harmless hobby he had been doing for years. But Linda didn't see it that way. One morning, Mr. Evans walked outside and stopped short to find another ticket on his door. "Mechanical work not approved," Linda announced. No explanation, no warning, just a command and a fine. He had no idea who he was paying. For the first time, I saw the fire in Mr. Evans's eyes go out. Something inside him had broken. Maybe his joy, maybe his faith in the neighborhood. But Linda didn't stop at adults. She targeted children too. One afternoon, I walked past David, a single father with 2 young sons. On the sidewalk in front of their house, there were scribbles in colored chalk, bright flowers, a smiling sun, a few unfinished letters. It was something I had seen in my childhood. But to Linda, it was an insult to the neighborhood. David walked out the door, his face pale as he saw another warning taped to the lamppost in front of the house. "Remove immediately or face enforcement." I saw David's hands clench. I saw the bewildered eyes of the 2 children as their father quickly grabbed a hose and wiped away the innocent drawings. This time, it wasn't just a small joy that had been taken away, but the childhoods of the children in this neighborhood. Linda continued to expand her power. She created new rules that no one had ever approved. Every house had to be painted in the HOA's color palette. No trees were allowed in the front yard taller than 5 feet, and if a guest stayed more than 3 nights, the HOA had to be notified. These rules never existed, but Linda enforced them as if they were immutable law. Anyone who dared to defy her would be blacklisted, sent additional warnings, and even threatened to report them to the HOA board. I could feel the fear creeping into every house. Neighbors no longer dared to stand in their front yards and chat, no longer left their windows open at night. When Linda's golf cart and the neighborhood patrol arrived, people ducked their heads and walked into their homes, avoiding her gaze. Greenwood Oaks had been a friendly community, a place where everyone helped each other. But Linda had turned it into a gated community, a place where every day was a test. I knew one thing: Linda's control wouldn't stop there. She was testing how far she could go, testing how many people would submit before someone would stand up. But then Linda made her biggest mistake. She targeted the wrong person, and that was the moment everything changed. For months, I watched from the sidelines, watching her take things. I wasn't one to rush into things that could be resolved on their own, and I knew that Linda was making enemies out of her own neighborhood. But what Linda didn't know was that she was targeting the wrong people. I came home from a long shift one night, exhausted, and all I wanted to do was sink into the couch, but as I stepped onto the front steps, I realized something was wrong. A pink note had been carefully tucked under the doormat, standing out in the pale yellow light of the porch. The familiarity of the tickets I'd seen my neighbors receive before made me pause for a moment. I bent down to pick them up, flipped them over, and read the bold print in the middle of the page: "House violation, unapproved vehicle entering the street." The words were printed neatly and crisply, as if this were an official notice. Below that was a line demanding payment of $100 within 3 days, with a warning that failure to comply would result in late fees. I exhaled slowly, feeling the absurdity spread through the words in my hands. Linda had ticketed me, a real cop, for not stopping at a fake checkpoint she'd set up. I looked around, searching for a shadowy figure in the darkness, but the neighborhood was as quiet as ever. Dim lights shone from the windows, a few cars parked silently along the street. Everything was normal, except for the fact that I had just been caught in the power play that Linda was setting up. I held the paper tightly in my hand, feeling its folds as if holding a declaration of war from the enemy. Maybe Linda thought she had succeeded in controlling everyone. Maybe she believed that no one could resist the system she had built. But this time she had chosen the wrong target. I'd seen all sorts of abusers in my years as a cop, but I never thought I'd have to deal with an HOA Karen who had created a fake police force and set up an unreasonable system of control in the middle of an ordinary neighborhood. Linda could threaten other neighbors, force them to take down their wind chimes, erase their harmless children's crayons, silence them with fear. But she couldn't do that to me. I wasn't one to succumb to cheap intimidation, and I knew better than anyone what the law looked like. For the first time since Linda began her power play, I was no longer a bystander. This ticket was more than a joke, it was a challenge. Linda probably believed that she could continue to push, continue to control, continue to impose her imaginary rules on others, without anyone daring to stand up to her. But she was about to learn something. The truth was that her power was not real, and she was about to face a lesson she would never forget. I told myself I wouldn't react immediately. Linda Monroe was the kind of person who believed she was right, that her power was unshakable. I'd seen all kinds of abuses, but never one woman with a handful of cheap neighborhood cops so brazenly defying the law in such a ridiculous way. I wanted to see how far she would go, how much more she could push the neighborhood under her control before it all came crashing down. But I didn't have to wait. Linda wouldn't stop, wouldn't be ignored, wouldn't pass up an opportunity to prove that she was the one in charge in Greenwood Oaks. I had just finished a long shift that day, and I was exhausted as I drove home, looking forward to lying down and having a quiet evening. But as I turned onto my familiar street, the first thing I saw wasn't the warm glow of houses or the shadows of trees swaying under streetlights. It was a human cordon blocking my driveway. The beam of my flashlight scanned my windshield defiantly. An old golf cart was parked across the driveway, a cheap, flashing light bar on top. Linda stood in the middle, arms crossed, her security guards behind her. A group of men in black polo shirts emblazoned with the words "Neighborhood Patrol" in bright white, radios in hand, eyes confident as if they were conducting a real raid. I turned off the car and watched the drama unfold. The fatigue was gone, replaced by a mixture of anger and disbelief. Linda had actually set up an HOA checkpoint right in front of my house. They stood in a line, their eyes burning with the determination I had seen in people who abused power. People who thought that if they lied long enough, big enough, people would believe they had real power. Linda held up a piece of paper as if it were a subpoena, as if she were representing an actual authority figure. She opened her mouth, her tone patronizing, and announced that I had violated HOA rules by not paying my fines and that now, according to rules, I was not allowed in the house until the money was paid. I could feel the tension in the air, but not from me, from them. I knew these people weren't police, they had no real power, and most importantly, they knew it, but Linda didn't. She stood tall, her eyes steady, believing that I would back down, believing that I would play by the arbitrary rules she had created. But Linda didn't know that I had faced men 1,000 times stronger than she, that I had faced situations where real power was determined by the law, not by meaningless pieces of paper. I didn't say anything right away, I just stood there, facing the men who were trying to show off their power. Then I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out my police badge, letting the streetlight reflect off its cold metal surface. The change in the atmosphere was almost immediate. The people behind Linda hesitated for a moment. Some glanced at each other. Some took a half step back. But Linda didn't do that. She stared at me, confusion flashing in her eyes. But in an instant, it turned to anger. I could see one thing in her eyes. She wouldn't give up. Linda lifted her chin, her tone sharp, declaring that the HOA had the right to make its own laws, that the neighborhood ordinances didn't have to follow state law, that the police weren't above the HOA. A faint smile crossed my lips. I'd seen this kind of stubbornness before. People who believed that if they just didn't accept the facts would go away. But the truth was, HOA laws don't trump actual laws. I didn't need to say much. I just took a step toward them, my eyes never leaving Linda. The neighborhood patrol backed away a little. One of them, a man standing at the edge, silently took his hand off his walkie-talkie, clearly understanding that they were playing with fire. But Linda didn't. She just stood there clutching the meaningless piece of paper in her hand like it was a talisman. She was used to imposing fear on others, but this time she couldn't do it to me. I didn't need to give orders. I didn't need to raise my voice. Just the presence of real law, everything Linda had created began to crack. One of her employees stepped back, then another. Their line of blocking the road was no longer as neat as before. And then, finally, Linda understood that she couldn't win this confrontation. She turned away, hopped into the golf cart with a huff, muttered something indignant, and walked away, followed by the disbanding patrol. As I stood there, watching the golf cart's flashing lights disappear into the night, I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Linda wasn't one to back down, but this time she'd met an opponent she couldn't beat, and I knew she wouldn't back down. She'd fight back. The only question was, how far would she go? I knew Linda Monroe wouldn't give up easily. She wasn't the type to accept defeat, especially when her pride was being challenged right in front of those who had once bowed to her orders. As Linda's golf cart sped away in anger, I knew for sure that this wasn't the end, but only the beginning of an even more vicious revenge. But even with my mental preparation, I still didn't expect her to act so despicably and lowly. The next morning, as I stepped out of the house to get the paper, I immediately sensed something was wrong. The normally crisp morning air was overshadowed by a strong, pungent odor, like chemicals mixed with undried paint. As I approached my patrol car, my heart sank in a moment of intense tension. The entire car, top to bottom, was covered in a thick layer of paint, glue, and unidentifiable dirt. Bright yellow X's were scrawled across the hood and windows, a blatant threat. The left side mirror was bent, and a warning was taped to the windshield in bright red letters: "Pay, fine, or leave the neighborhood." I stood there, clutching the paper in my hand, feeling every muscle in my body tense. The anger didn't come immediately, but rather a slow, rising undercurrent, swirling in my chest like a storm waiting to erupt. Linda had crossed a line. This wasn't just meaningless tickets or idle threats. This was intentional vandalism, a true declaration of war. But what enraged me most wasn't the damage to my car. It was that Linda wasn't just targeting me. When I looked up, I saw my neighbors standing in front of their houses too, their eyes wide with horror at the sight before them. It wasn't just my car. Several other cars in the neighborhood had been vandalized in similar fashion. An SUV parked 2 doors down had its windows covered in black paint. The words "Flower Neighborhood" scrawled across its hood. A minivan in front of Mrs. Dell's house had the words "Flower Dep" scrawled in pink paint, as if Linda had left a mark on anyone who dared to oppose her. But the worst part wasn't the paint or the glue. It was the hateful messages taped to every car and every front door. A note was shoved into a young family's windshield wiper and read in a scathing tone, "Not compliance, move." A sign nailed to Mr. Evans's door, where Linda had warned him for repairing his car in her yard, read, scrawled in red marker, "The neighborhood make her ugly." I felt my blood rush through my veins as I realized this wasn't a prank. It was an organized campaign of revenge. I bent down and ran my fingers over the dirty paint, feeling the glue that had dried with time. It must have been done the night before, when everyone was asleep, when the darkness hid the vileness of whoever did it. I clenched my fists, feeling my knuckles turn white. I had seen abusers, seen people who used the law as a weapon to control others, but Linda was beyond them all. She was no longer just a control freak, but a dictator who would destroy anyone who dared to stand up to her. I took a deep breath, trying to keep myself from acting on my anger. I looked around. My neighbors were still standing there, their eyes filled with horror and rage. They were no longer silent victims. Now they were waiting for something to happen, for someone to do something. Linda made a terrible mistake. She thought her actions would scare people, that the neighborhood would continue to bow its head and remain silent. But I saw the opposite. I saw angry eyes, clenched fists, faces tired of being oppressed. I knew that at this point no one wanted to take it anymore. Linda had pushed things too far, and now she was going to pay the price. I looked back at my car, the paint still glistening in the morning sun, but I didn't care anymore. What mattered was that this would be the last time Linda would dare do this. I was no longer a bystander, and this time I was going to make sure Linda Monroe never got the chance to do this again. I wasn't the only one standing in front of my house that morning, staring at the paint on my car with a mixture of rage and disbelief. So were my neighbors. They quietly emerged from their homes, looking at the traces of hate that Linda Monroe had left on cars, doors, sidewalks, the twisted marks of someone who had sunk too deep into her own delusion of power. The silence that had settled over the neighborhood was not resignation, but a rage that was slowly but surely building, like a storm about to erupt. Linda thought she could intimidate and force everyone to submit, but she had forgotten that when pushed to the limit, people lose their fear. I saw Mr. Evans, whom Linda had warned him about fixing his car in the yard, come out of the front door, staring at the scrawled words on the wooden board nailed to his door. Mrs. Dell stood a few doors away, shaking her hand as she removed a piece of paper that read, "Noise disturbance," from the mailbox. I looked around and realized that, in that moment, people were no longer just isolated victims of oppression. They were seeing their own pain reflected in the injustice of others. Something had changed in them. I could feel it from the first glance they gave me, no longer avoiding me as before, no longer the invisible fear that kept them silent. And then, as if they all understood what had to be done, one nodded, then another. No one needed to say much, but everyone knew that this day would not end like the days before. That evening, an impromptu meeting took place at Mr. Evans's house. I had never seen his living room so crowded. Familiar faces from the neighborhood, people I had seen bowing to Linda, hurrying to close their doors when her neighborhood patrol passed by, were sitting together, sharing stories they had kept to themselves. Mrs. Dell's story of the threats she received when she refused to remove her wind chimes. David, a single father's story of the unreasonable warnings he received when his children drew chalk on the sidewalk. A woman down the street told of sleepless nights when Linda's patrols shone flashlights into her windows in the middle of the night, calling it a neighborhood safety check. A young couple told of how Linda had sent them letters demanding that they change the color of their house because it didn't meet her aesthetic standards. As each story was told, the anger grew. No one wanted to be silent anymore. They had had enough. I looked around the room, feeling the determination building inside each person. Linda had done something I don't think she could have imagined. She had created the strongest unity this neighborhood had ever known. We began gathering evidence. Photos of vandalized cars, the ridiculous tickets Linda had set out, the threatening text messages, videos of the neighborhood patrol trespassing on private property. I coached them on how to write an official report, how to take clear, convincing statements. I saw in their eyes that there was no more hesitation, only determination. Linda thought she could control everything, that she could silence each person, but she forgot that one person can be isolated but not a community. The people who had been threatened, who had bowed their heads, now stood together, and they would not let Linda continue to act like this for another day. When I left Mr. Evans' house that night, my steps were lighter. But I knew in my heart that this was only the beginning. Linda had no idea what was coming to her, but this time we would not back down. I knew Linda Monroe would never give up easily. That night's meeting was not the end of her control, but only the beginning of a new escalation. Linda was not the type to accept defeat quietly, and if there was one thing I had learned in my years as a cop, it was that people like her always chose the wrong response when pushed to the limit. I had prepared myself for that. I knew Linda would not back down, that she would find a way to fight back, that her thirst for power had outpaced her sanity and reason. And as I predicted, it didn't take long for her to prove it. The first message came 3 days later, just before midnight. A neighbor sent me a photo of a flashlight beam sweeping across parked cars, accompanied by a terse caption, "They're patrolling." Before I could reply, another message came, "They're setting up checkpoints again, right at the entrance to the neighborhood." I sat up straight, alertness replacing sleepiness. I wasn't surprised. I'd been expecting this. Linda, never one to give up, decided to bet it all on a bold move. As I drove closer to the entrance to the neighborhood, I didn't have to get too close to see how far she'd gone. Flashlights shone directly into the windshields of approaching cars. A crude barricade of plastic poles and fake caution tape blocked part of the road. Linda's neighborhood patrol stood in a line, wearing black polo shirts that said "Neighborhood Security," radios in hand, trying to project the image of a real law enforcement force. Linda stood in the middle, clutching a clipboard, her eyes confident and determined, as if she actually had the authority to do this. I wasn't alone. I knew what was coming. As I turned onto a nearby street, I noticed the flashing red and blue lights reflected in the windows of the houses. The police were coming. They came quickly, without sirens, without warning, but with enough force to shatter Linda's illusions. As soon as the patrol cars appeared, the tension in the air was torn apart by the captain's firm voice. The order was given clearly, with authority. These were real cops, this was no game, and everything Linda had built up would come crashing down right here. One member of Linda's patrol flinched, another backed away silently, but she remained stubborn. She shouted meaningless statements about HOA authority, trying to cling to the illusion of control. But as the officer read out the charges, harassment, vandalism, impersonation, panic flashed in her eyes. The handcuffs tightened and Linda struggled helplessly. Her authority had collapsed. When the neighborhood patrol was arrested, the arrogant look in their eyes disappeared. Some mumbled apologies, but it didn't matter. I watched Linda's police car drive away. For the first time in months, the neighborhood felt like it should have. Lights came on, doors opened. No fear, just relief. I put my badge on the table and looked out the window. Linda thought she had everything under control, but she forgot that justice always prevails. The next morning, residents gathered in front of Linda's house. There was no celebration, just thoughtful looks. The golf cart with its fake light bar was abandoned. The HOA signs were torn down. When the police investigated, they discovered that Linda had no real power. It was all a farce. The HOA quickly denied responsibility, but no one believed her. Linda was charged with a series of crimes. Those who had been loyal to her pleaded guilty, saying they were just following orders. Some received light sentences. Others were charged with complicity, but none suffered as badly as Linda. With her gone, the neighborhood slowly returned to normal. No more patrols, no more unreasonable rules. Mrs. Dell hung wind chimes without protest. Mr. Evans continued to repair his car without being disturbed. Children chalked the sidewalks without being considered vandals. Linda, in her tyranny, had inadvertently brought Greenwood Oaks together more than ever. I stood on my porch, looking out at the long, quiet street under the streetlights. No one was lurking, no more silent footsteps of self-permitted policemen, just the soft hum of insects, the wind rustling through the trees. Greenwood Oaks was itself again. Linda Monroe believed she could control everything, that fear would keep the neighborhood bowed forever. But she forgot that oppression doesn't last forever. When everyone stands up, tyrants fall. And the story of Greenwood Oaks is a clear example of that.